The dust cloud from the approaching black sedan made my heart pound against my ribs as I stood on the porch of what I'd just learned was my inheritance. 3 months ago, I was Jeffrey Rivera, 17 years old, aging out of Maplewood Children's Home with nothing but a duffel bag and a bus ticket to nowhere. Now I was standing on 200 acres of Montana ranch land that supposedly belonged to me, watching what looked like trouble pull up my gravel driveway. The man who stepped out of that sedan wore a suit too expensive for our county and carried papers that he claimed would take everything away from me before I'd even had a chance to understand what everything meant. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this all started, because the story of how I went from having no family to inheriting a grandfather's secret is one that still amazes me every single day. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. I want to know if any of you have experienced something like this, because what happened to me changed everything I thought I knew about family, belonging, and what it means to have a home. It was a Tuesday morning in March when Virginia Morris, the director of Maplewood Children's Home, called me into her office. I'd been living there for 8 years, ever since I was 9, and the state finally gave up trying to place me with foster families who kept sending me back. Virginia had been more of a mother to me than anyone else ever had, but even she couldn't hide the sadness in her eyes when she had to deliver the news that I'd be aging out in 2 months. "Jeffrey," she said, her voice softer than usual, "we need to talk about your transition plan." She had folders spread across her desk, applications for community college, information about job training programs, details about the tiny studio apartment the state would help me afford for exactly 6 months before I was completely on my own. I'd been dreading this conversation for years, knowing it was coming, but never feeling ready for it. That's when the phone rang. Virginia answered with her usual professional tone, but I watched her expression change as she listened to whoever was on the other end. Her eyebrows rose, then furrowed, then rose again. She kept looking at me while she talked, which made my stomach twist with anxiety. "Yes, he's here," she said finally. "Yes, I can confirm that Jeffrey Rivera has been a resident here since 2016. No, there's no family contact information in his file. His parents died in a car accident when he was 9, and we were never able to locate any relatives." She paused, listening. "I see. Yes, that would be quite unexpected. May I ask how you obtained this information?" The conversation went on for another 10 minutes, with Virginia taking notes and asking questions I couldn't quite follow. When she finally hung up, she stared at me for a long moment before speaking. "Jeffrey, that was a lawyer from Montana, a man named Jason Rogers. He says he represents the estate of someone named Lionel Kelly, and according to his records, Lionel Kelly was your grandfather." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. "That's impossible," I said. "I don't have any family. The social workers checked everything when my parents died. There was nobody." Virginia picked up my file, the thick folder that contained everything the state knew about my life. "Let me read you something," she said, flipping through pages. "When you were placed in care, the intake report says your mother, Maria Rivera, was estranged from her family. Your father, David Rivera, was an only child whose parents had died years earlier. The social workers did attempt to locate maternal relatives, but Maria's family had apparently cut all contact with her years before your birth. So this grandfather," I said, the word feeling strange in my mouth, "he knew about me, but never tried to contact me?" "According to Mr. Rogers, Lionel Kelly spent years trying to find you after your parents died, but the name change when your mother married made it difficult. Your mother's maiden name was Kelly. Lionel Kelly was her father, which would make him your grandfather." Virginia's voice was gentle, but I could hear the excitement building despite her professional demeanor. "Jeffrey, he left you a ranch, 200 acres in Montana, plus a house, outbuildings, and livestock." The next few weeks passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and preparations I never thought I'd be making. Jason Rogers, the lawyer, was patient with my questions and detailed in his explanations. Lionel Kelly had owned a cattle ranch outside a small town called Cedar Falls, Montana. He'd never married, never had children of his own, and after my mother left home at 18 following some kind of family argument that Rogers didn't have details about, Lionel had spent decades regretting the harsh words that drove her away. He hired private investigators, Rogers told me during one of our phone calls. After your parents died, he knew he had a grandson somewhere in the system, but tracking you down took years. By the time he found you, he was already sick with the cancer that eventually killed him. He was afraid that showing up suddenly might traumatize you further, so he decided to leave you the ranch in his will instead. The ranch came with conditions, though. I had to live on the property for at least 1 year and make a genuine effort to maintain it. If I abandoned it or sold it within 5 years, the land would go to the state of Montana for conservation. Rogers explained that Lionel had wanted to make sure I understood the value of the land and the responsibility that came with it. Virginia helped me apply for early emancipation so I could claim my inheritance before turning 18. The process was complicated, but having a substantial inheritance actually made it easier to convince the court that I could support myself. Within 6 weeks of that first phone call, I was standing in the Greyhound station with a one-way ticket to Cedar Falls, Montana, and a head full of dreams about what my new life might look like. The bus ride took 2 days, with stops in cities I'd only heard about in geography class. I watched the landscape change from the familiar urban sprawl of my childhood to endless fields, rolling hills, and eventually the dramatic peaks of the Rocky Mountains. Every mile took me further from everything I'd ever known and closer to a future that felt both terrifying and full of possibility. Cedar Falls turned out to be the kind of small town you see in movies about rural America. Main Street had a diner, a feed store, a small grocery, and a few other businesses that looked like they'd been there for decades. The people I saw walking around moved with the unhurried pace of folks who knew everyone in town and had nowhere urgent to be. It was so different from the city where I'd grown up that I might as well have traveled to another planet. Jason Rogers met me at the tiny bus depot in his pickup truck, a practical vehicle that was clean but clearly used for actual work. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe in his 30s, with the kind of tan that comes from spending time outdoors and calluses that suggested he knew his way around manual labor despite being a lawyer. "You must be Jeffrey," he said, extending a hand for a firm shake. "I'm Jason. Welcome to Cedar Falls." He looked me over with the assessing gaze of someone trying to figure out if I was up to the challenge ahead of me. "You ready to see your inheritance?" The drive to the ranch took about 20 minutes on roads that got progressively more rural. Jason filled the time by giving me a rundown of the basics. The ranch had been in the Kelly family for 3 generations. It was primarily a cattle operation, though Lionel had also raised horses and grown hay. The nearest neighbor was about a mile away, and the house had been empty for 6 months since Lionel's death. "I should warn you," Jason said as we turned onto a gravel road marked with a weathered sign that read Kelly Ranch. "The place needs work." Lionel was sick for the last 2 years of his life, and he wasn't able to keep up with maintenance the way he used to. The structure is sound, but there are repairs that need to be done and systems that need updating. When we crested a small hill and I got my first look at the ranch, I understood what he meant. The house was a 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch, painted white but showing its age in peeling patches in weathered wood. The barn was massive and red, traditional in the way that made it look like it belonged on a postcard. But even from a distance, I could see missing boards and a roof that had seen better days. Fencing stretched across rolling pastures where cattle grazed, and mountains rose in the distance like something out of a nature documentary. It was beautiful and overwhelming and completely unlike anything I'd ever imagined owning. As we pulled up to the house, I tried to picture my mother growing up here, tried to imagine what kind of argument could have been serious enough to make her leave all this behind and never come back. Jason had the keys and walked me through the house room by room, pointing out features and problems with equal attention to detail. The kitchen was spacious but outdated, with appliances from the 1980s and linoleum flooring that had seen decades of farm boots. The living room had a stone fireplace that dominated one wall and furniture covered in dust sheets. Upstairs were 4 bedrooms, including what had obviously been my mother's room, still decorated with the kind of flowered wallpaper and white furniture that suggested it hadn't been changed since she was a teenager. The most surprising discovery was Lionel's study, a room lined with bookshelves and filing cabinets that contained what looked like decades of ranch records, family documents, and personal papers. Jason showed me a desk drawer that had been specifically set aside for me, containing a thick envelope with my name written on it in careful handwriting. "He left this for you," Jason said. "I was instructed not to give it to you until you'd seen the ranch and decided whether you wanted to stay." Inside the envelope were three items: a letter addressed to me, a photograph of a young woman who looked startlingly like my mother, and a smaller envelope marked, "For Maria's son, if he chooses to stay." The letter was written in the same careful handwriting as my name on the envelope. "Dear Jeffrey," it began, "if you're reading this, then you've decided to come to Montana and see what your old grandfather left you. I know you don't know me, and I know your mother probably never spoke about me, but I want you to know that not a day has passed since she left that I haven't regretted the words that drove her away. I was proud and stubborn, and I let my pride cost me the chance to know my daughter and my grandson. I can't undo that mistake, but I can give you something that might help you understand where you come from and who you are." The letter went on to explain that the photograph was of my grandmother, Catherine Kelly, who had died when my mother was 16. Lionel described her as the heart of their family, the one who could always smooth over arguments and bring peace to their home. After she died, he and my mother had struggled to communicate, and their relationship had deteriorated until the fight that made her leave. "Your mother wanted to go to college," the letter continued. "She was smart, smarter than me, and she had dreams of seeing the world beyond Cedar Falls. I thought she was rejecting everything I'd worked to build, rejecting the ranch and the life I wanted to share with her. I said things I shouldn't have said, things about duty and responsibility and knowing your place. She said things too about small minds and small towns and small dreams. We were both hurt and angry, and neither of us knew how to take back the words once they were spoken." Reading about the argument that had shaped my entire life without me knowing it felt surreal. My mother had never talked about her family, and I'd assumed that meant there simply wasn't any family to talk about. Now I was learning that she'd grown up on this ranch, that she'd had a father who loved her but didn't know how to show it, that there had been a whole life here that she'd walked away from. The smaller envelope contained a bank statement and a set of keys. Lionel had set up a trust fund for ranch maintenance and improvements, with enough money to cover expenses for the first year while I learned how to manage the property. The keys were for a pickup truck that was parked in the barn, a vehicle he'd bought but barely used during his final illness. "There's one more thing," Jason said as I finished reading. "Lionel arranged for you to have help learning the ranch business. Michael Brooks runs the neighboring spread, and he's agreed to provide guidance and assistance for your first year. He's been looking after your cattle since Lionel died, making sure they were fed and cared for." The next morning I met Michael Brooks, and it was immediately clear why Lionel had trusted him to help me. Michael was in his 50s, weathered and practical, with the kind of easy competence that comes from decades of doing difficult work well. He showed up at sunrise with coffee and a thermos of what turned out to be the best scrambled eggs I'd ever tasted, courtesy of his wife Sharon. "Lionel was a good neighbor and a good man," Michael told me, as we walked through the pastures checking on the cattle that were now technically mine. "He made mistakes with your mother, but he spent the last 20 years of his life regretting those mistakes. This ranch meant everything to him, but it would have meant more if he had had family to share it with." Michael's approach to teaching me was hands-on and patient. He showed me how to check the cattle for signs of illness, how to repair fencing, how to operate the equipment in the barn. He explained the seasonal rhythms of ranch life, the cycles of breeding and calving, the timing of hay cutting and winter preparation. It was overwhelming at first, but I found myself genuinely interested in learning, partly because the work was satisfying in a way I'd never experienced. "You've got good instincts," Michael told me that after I'd been there for 2 weeks. "Cattle can sense when someone's nervous or unsure, but they seem to trust you. That's not something you can teach. The physical work is demanding but rewarding." I'd never been particularly athletic, but ranch work built strength and endurance in a way that felt natural and purposeful. I was eating better than I ever had, sleeping better, and waking up each morning with a clear sense of what needed to be done. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere. The people of Cedar Falls were cautious about accepting me at first, which I understood. Small towns are naturally suspicious of outsiders, and I was not only an outsider, but one who had inherited a significant property without having earned it in their eyes. But Michael Brooks's endorsement carried weight, and gradually I began to build relationships with the local business owners and other ranchers. Gloria Wood ran the feed store and had known my mother when she was young. Maria was always restless, she told me one afternoon when I was buying supplies. Smart as a whip and pretty as a picture, but she had her sights set on bigger things than Cedar Falls could offer. Can't say I blamed her, but it broke Lionel's heart when she left. The more I learned about my mother's life here, the more complex the picture became. She hadn't been the rebellious teenager I'd imagined based on Lionel's letter. According to Gloria and others who remembered her, Maria had been involved in school activities, had friends, had seemed generally happy, but she'd also been academically gifted in a way that made college seem not just desirable, but necessary. The fight wasn't really about the ranch, Gloria explained. It was about Lionel being afraid of losing her and not knowing how to say that. He thought if he could convince her that her duty was here, she'd stay. But Maria saw it as him not believing in her dreams. I started spending evenings in Lionel's study, reading through his papers and trying to piece together the story of our family. I found letters he'd written but never sent, draft after draft of apologies that never made it to the mail. I found newspaper clippings about my parents' accident, evidence that he'd been following my mother's life from a distance even after she left. Most heartbreaking were the birthday cards he'd bought for me every year since I was born. Cards with messages written inside but never sent because he didn't know where to find me. The work of running the ranch was becoming more familiar, but I still had a lot to learn. Michael introduced me to other ranchers in the area, men and women who'd been working the land for generations and who gradually began to accept me as Lionel's heir. They shared knowledge freely once they decided I was serious about making the ranch work, teaching me everything from veterinary basics to equipment maintenance. One evening in late summer, I was sitting on the porch after a long day of fence repair when a car I didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. The man who got out was wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in the rural setting, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that suggested he was used to getting his way. "You must be Jeffrey Rivera," he said as he approached the porch. "I'm Justin Baker, and I represent certain interests that would like to discuss a business proposition with you." I invited him inside, curious about what kind of business proposition would bring someone in a suit to a cattle ranch at sunset. Justin Baker turned out to be a land developer who represented a company interested in buying the ranch for a housing development. The offer he presented was substantial, enough money to set me up for life if I invested it wisely. "You're young," he said, spreading papers across the kitchen table. "You could take this money, go to college, see the world, do whatever you want with your life. Why tie yourself down to this place when you could have complete freedom?" The offer was tempting in ways I hadn't expected. The work was hard, the isolation was sometimes difficult, and I was still learning so much that I felt overwhelmed regularly. Taking the money would solve all my immediate problems and give me options I'd never had before. But as I looked around the kitchen where my mother had grown up, where Lionel had spent decades hoping for a chance to make things right with his family, I realized that selling would mean abandoning the connection to my history that I'd only just discovered. "I need some time to think about it," I told Justin Baker, and he left his card with instructions to call him within a week. That night, I called Virginia Morris back at the children's home. I needed to talk to someone who knew me well enough to help me think through the decision. She listened as I explained the offer and my conflicted feelings about it. "Jeffrey," she said when I finished, "in all the years I've known you, I've never heard you sound as settled and content as you do now. You sound like you've found something that fits you. Money is important, but it's not the only thing that matters." The next morning, I drove into town to talk to Jason Rogers about the legal implications of selling the ranch. His office was above the diner on Main Street, a small space that felt more like someone's den than a professional law office. Jason listened to my description of Justin Baker's offer with a thoughtful expression. "That's a significant amount of money," he acknowledged. "But before you make any decisions, there are some things you should know about the conditions of your inheritance." He pulled out a copy of Lionel's will and showed me sections I hadn't paid close attention to during our first meeting. The ranch came with restrictions that would make selling complicated. If I sold within the first 5 years, the proceeds would be significantly reduced by penalties and taxes that Lionel had specifically built into the inheritance structure. He really didn't want this land broken up for development, Jason explained. Lionel believed that once ranch land gets converted to housing, it's lost forever. He structured the inheritance to encourage you to give ranching a real try before making any permanent decisions. More importantly, Jason had done some research on Justin Baker and the company he represented. They had a pattern of buying ranch land, subdividing it into small lots, and building cheaply constructed houses that they marketed to city people looking for rural lifestyle properties. The developments rarely integrated well with the existing community and often created problems with water rights and infrastructure. "I'm not telling you what to do," Jason said, "but I think you should talk to some of the other ranchers about what development would mean for this area. And you might want to spend some more time thinking about what Lionel was really trying to give you." I spent the next few days talking to Michael Brooks and other neighbors about Justin Baker's offer. Their reactions were uniformly negative, not just because they opposed development in principle, but because they'd seen what happened to other rural communities when developers moved in. "It changes everything," Sharon Murphy, Michael's wife, told me over dinner at their house. "Property taxes go up, traffic increases, and the whole character of the place shifts. Pretty soon, the people who've lived here for generations can't afford to stay." Michael was more direct. "That land has been in your family for 3 generations, Jeffrey. Your great-grandfather bought it when this was still frontier country. Your grandfather spent his whole life improving it, building it into something he could be proud of. You want to let some developer from Denver turn it into a subdivision called something like Mountain View Estates?" The more I thought about it, the more I realized that selling would be a betrayal not just of Lionel's wishes, but of something deeper. This ranch represented continuity, connection to the land, and to a way of life that was becoming increasingly rare. I was part of something larger than myself, part of a story that had been going on for generations and that I had the opportunity to continue. When Justin Baker called to follow up on his offer, I told him I wasn't interested in selling. He tried to negotiate, increasing the offer and suggesting various compromises, but I'd made my decision. The ranch was staying in the family. "You're making a mistake," he said, his friendly demeanor shifting to something more aggressive. "You're just a kid who doesn't understand what he's giving up. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." "Maybe," I said, "but it's my mistake to make." After I hung up, I felt a sense of relief that surprised me. I'd been carrying the weight of the decision for weeks, and now that it was made, I could focus on the work of actually running the ranch. Fall was coming, which meant preparing for winter, and Michael had warned me that my first Montana winter would be a learning experience. The work of preparing for winter was intensive and educational. We moved cattle to pastures closer to the barn, stockpiled hay and feed, checked and repaired equipment that would be essential during the cold months. Michael taught me to read weather patterns and plan ahead for storms that could last for days. "Winter separates the real ranchers from the people who are just playing at it," he told me as we worked on winterizing the water systems. "You can't call in sick when it's 20 below and the cattle need to be fed. You can't take a vacation when a blizzard hits and the power goes out. This isn't a job you can walk away from when it gets difficult." I was beginning to understand what he meant. Ranch life demanded a level of commitment and responsibility that was different from anything I'd experienced. The cattle depended on me, the land required constant attention, and there was always something that needed to be fixed, improved, or maintained. But instead of feeling trapped by these responsibilities, I found them grounding in a way I hadn't expected. As autumn progressed, I began to feel more confident in my abilities and more connected to the community. Other ranchers started including me in their informal networks of mutual support, calling when they needed an extra hand or offering help when I was struggling with something beyond my experience. I was invited to community events, asked to join the local cattlemen's association, treated as someone who belonged rather than an outsider who happened to own land. The transformation wasn't just external. I was changing too, becoming more self-reliant and confident, developing skills and knowledge I'd never imagined needing. The physical work had made me stronger, but more importantly, the mental challenges of ranch management were developing problem-solving abilities and judgment that served me well beyond the boundaries of my property. One evening in October, I was going through more of Lionel's papers when I found a folder I'd missed before tucked behind other files in his desk. It contained correspondence with private investigators, documentation of his efforts to find me after my parents died. The papers told a story of determined searching that had lasted for years, with false leads and dead ends, and the persistent hope that he would eventually locate his grandson. The most moving document was a letter he'd written to me but never sent, dated just 6 months before his death. In it, he wrote about his regrets, his hopes for my future, and his dream that someday I might come to understand and appreciate the ranch that had been his life's work. "I know I failed your mother," the letter said. "I was too proud to admit when I was wrong, too stubborn to reach out when I should have swallowed my pride and made things right. I hope you'll be wiser than I was, Jeffrey. I hope you'll understand that family isn't just about blood. It's about the choices we make and the people we decide to love and support. This ranch has been my family for 20 years, but I always hoped it would be yours too." Reading those words made me understand something important about inheritance that went beyond property and money. Lionel hadn't just left me a ranch, he'd left me a place in a community, a connection to the land, and an opportunity to be part of something larger than myself. The cattle, the neighbors, the seasonal rhythms of rural life. They were all part of what he'd wanted to share with me. Winter arrived early that year, with a blizzard in November that tested everything Michael had taught me about preparation and perseverance. For 3 days, the wind howled and the snow fell steadily, creating drifts that blocked roads and knocked out power lines. I spent those days checking on cattle, breaking ice on water troughs, and making sure the animals had enough feed to survive the storm. It was exhausting and sometimes frightening work, but I discovered that I was capable of handling challenges I'd never faced before. When the storm finally passed and the sun came out, revealing a landscape transformed by snow, I felt a sense of accomplishment that was different from anything I'd experienced. I'd taken care of my responsibilities, protected the animals in my care, and proven to myself that I could handle whatever Montana weather threw at me. Michael showed up the morning after the storm to check on me, bringing coffee and Sharon's homemade cinnamon rolls. "How'd you do?" he asked, looking around at the cattle that were healthy and the systems that had continued functioning despite the harsh conditions. "Better than I expected," I said, and I meant it. The storm had been a test, and I'd passed it. "Lionel would be proud," Michael said, and I realized that earning his respect meant more to me than I'd understood. Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. Calving season required round-the-clock vigilance, with regular checks on pregnant cows and immediate response to any problems during births. I learned to assist with difficult deliveries, to recognize signs of illness in newborn calves, to manage the complex logistics of a growing herd. The work was demanding, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways I struggled to explain to my old friends from the children's home when they called. They were dealing with the challenges of college, entry-level jobs, and urban life, while I was learning to read weather patterns and manage livestock. Our experiences were diverging in ways that made communication difficult, but I didn't regret the path I'd chosen. By summer, I was operating the ranch with minimal assistance from Michael, though I still relied on his advice for major decisions. The property was thriving under my management. The cattle were healthy and multiplying, and I'd made improvements to infrastructure that increased efficiency and reduced long-term maintenance costs. More importantly, I felt like I belonged in Cedar Falls in a way I'd never belonged anywhere else. The community had accepted me not just as Lionel's heir, but as someone who'd proven himself capable of carrying on the traditions and responsibilities that came with the land. I had friends, neighbors who depended on me and whom I could depend on, and a sense of purpose that gave meaning to every day. One afternoon in July, I was working on fence repairs when I saw a familiar black sedan coming up the driveway. Justin Baker got out, looking less polished than he had during his first visit. His suit was wrinkled, his confidence seemed forced, and he carried himself like someone who was running out of options. "Jeffrey," he said as he approached, "I hope you have had time to reconsider my offer. I'm prepared to increase it significantly." I set down my tools and gave him my full attention. "Mr. Baker, I told you last year that I wasn't interested in selling. Nothing has changed." "Everything has changed," he said, his voice taking on a desperate edge. The development company I represent has already invested significant resources in this project. We've done soil studies, environmental assessments, infrastructure planning. We need your land to make the project viable. He spread new papers on the tailgate of my truck, showing revised offers that were substantially higher than his original proposal. The numbers were impressive, enough money to set me up for life several times over. But I'd learned something important during my year on the ranch. Money wasn't the only measure of value, and some things couldn't be replaced once they were lost. I understand you've invested resources, I said, but that doesn't create any obligation on my part. This land isn't for sale. Justin Baker's facade finally cracked completely. You're being foolish, he said angrily. You're a kid playing at being a rancher. You have no idea what you're doing or what you're giving up. This land would be much better used for housing development than for your little hobby farm. His words stung because they echoed doubts I'd had about myself during difficult moments over the past year. Was I really capable of managing a ranch long-term? Was I honoring Lionel's legacy or just postponing the inevitable? But as I looked around at the healthy cattle, the well-maintained facilities, and the land that had become home to me, I knew that my decision was right. Mr. Baker, I said calmly, I think you should leave, and I don't want you coming back here again. He gathered his papers with angry, jerky movements, muttering about missed opportunities and foolish decisions. As he drove away, I felt a sense of finality that was deeply satisfying. I'd faced the temptation to take an easy path and had chosen the more difficult but more meaningful option. That evening, I called Virginia Morris to tell her about the encounter and to update her on how the ranch was doing. She listened with the patient attention she'd always given me, asking questions about the cattle, the community, and my plans for the future. You sound different, Jeffrey, she said when I finished my update. You sound like someone who knows exactly where he belongs. She was right. The uncertain, rootless teenager who'd left the children's home 15 months earlier had been replaced by someone with confidence, purpose, and deep connections to both land and community. I'd found not just a home, but an identity that felt authentic and sustainable. As summer turned to fall, I began planning improvements for the following year. I wanted to expand the herd, upgrade some equipment, and implement conservation practices that would improve the long-term health of the pastures. These weren't the plans of someone who was just marking time until a better opportunity came along. They were the plans of someone committed to building something lasting. The second winter was easier than the first, not because the weather was milder, but because I was better prepared and more confident in my abilities. I'd learned to anticipate problems, to maintain equipment proactively, and to read the subtle signs that indicated when cattle needed extra attention. The work was still demanding, but it no longer felt overwhelming. In February, I received a letter that surprised me. It was from a young woman named Catherine Wright, who identified herself as a distant cousin, the granddaughter of Lionel's brother who'd moved to California decades earlier. She'd learned about my inheritance through family connections and wanted to establish contact with the Montana branch of the Kelly family. I've been researching our family history, she wrote, and I'd love to hear about the ranch and about Lionel. My grandfather used to tell stories about growing up in Montana, but he lost touch with his brother years ago. I'm planning a trip to Montana this summer and would love to visit if you're willing to meet. The idea of having actual family, people who shared my blood and my history, was both exciting and intimidating. I'd grown accustomed to thinking of myself as essentially alone in the world, with only the community connections I'd built in Cedar Falls. The possibility of cousins and extended family opened up new questions about identity and belonging. When Catherine Wright visited in June, she turned out to be about my age, a college student studying agriculture with plans to work in sustainable farming. She was fascinated by the ranch and knowledgeable about cattle in ways that surprised me. We spent 3 days touring the property, talking about family history, and discovering that we shared not just genes but interests and values. This place is amazing, she said as we watched the sunset from the porch where I'd first met Justin Baker. Lionel did incredible work here, the land management, the breeding program, the infrastructure. It's all top quality. You're really lucky to have inherited this. I'm beginning to understand that, I said. It took me a while to appreciate what I'd been given. Catherine's visit connected me to a broader family network that I'd never known existed. Through her, I learned about other cousins, aunts and uncles, and family traditions that stretch back generations. I wasn't as alone in the world as I believed, and the ranch wasn't just an isolated property, but part of a larger family legacy. More importantly, Catherine's agricultural background helped me see the ranch from a new perspective. She pointed out conservation practices I could implement, suggested improvements to my breeding program, and shared knowledge about sustainable ranching that could increase both profitability and environmental stewardship. Have you thought about organic certification? She asked during one of our conversations. There's a growing market for grass-fed, organically raised beef, and your operation is already pretty close to meeting the standards. The idea of organic certification opened up new possibilities for the ranch's future. It would require changes to my management practices and a significant investment in documentation and compliance. But it could also differentiate my cattle in the marketplace and potentially increase profitability substantially. Over the following months, I researched organic certification requirements and began implementing the necessary changes. The process was complex and time-consuming, but it gave me a new sense of purpose and direction. I wasn't just maintaining the ranch Lionel had left me, I was improving it and adapting it for the future. The organic certification process also connected me to other ranchers who were pursuing similar goals, creating a network of relationships that extended far beyond Cedar Falls. I attended conferences, participated in online forums, and learned from people who were innovating in sustainable agriculture. By the end of my second year on the ranch, I felt like I'd truly made it my own while still honoring Lionel's legacy. The operation was profitable, the land was healthy, and I had plans for continued growth and improvement. More importantly, I had a clear sense of identity and purpose that had been missing from my life for 17 years. The third spring brought an unexpected challenge that tested everything I'd learned about ranching and community relationships. A late blizzard caught everyone off guard, arriving in April when the cattle had already been moved to summer pastures. The storm was severe enough to threaten newborn calves that hadn't yet developed the resilience to survive prolonged cold and wind. Michael Brooks called me at dawn the morning the storm hit. "We need to get your cattle to shelter," he said without preamble. "This storm is going to be bad, and those calves won't make it if we leave them in the open pastures." What followed was one of the most challenging days I'd experienced since inheriting the ranch. With help from Michael, Sharon, and several other neighbors who showed up without being asked, we spent hours in blinding snow and brutal wind, moving cattle to sheltered areas and checking on animals that were at risk. The work was dangerous and exhausting, but it demonstrated something important about the community I'd become part of. When crisis struck, people showed up to help without being asked and without expecting anything in return. It was the kind of mutual support that made rural life sustainable, and I was both grateful to receive it and proud to be considered worthy of it. We saved most of the calves, though we lost a few despite our best efforts. The losses were heartbreaking, but they were also part of ranching that I was learning to accept. Not every season would be successful, not every decision would work out perfectly, and the weather and other factors beyond my control would always be part of the equation. "You handled that well," Michael told me as we were cleaning up after the storm passed. "3 years ago, you wouldn't have known what to do in a situation like that. Now you're thinking like a rancher, planning ahead and adapting to circumstances." His words meant more to me than he probably realized. I'd been worried that I was still playing at being a rancher, that I hadn't really earned the respect of my neighbors or proven myself capable of handling serious challenges. The storm had been a test, and apparently I'd passed it. That summer, I received organic certification for the ranch, a milestone that represented years of work and learning. The certification opened up new markets and allowed me to charge premium prices for my cattle, but more importantly, it represented a commitment to stewardship and sustainability that felt aligned with my values. The success of the organic program attracted attention from agricultural publications and sustainable farming organizations. I was invited to speak at conferences about my experience transitioning a traditional ranch to organic practices, and I found that I enjoyed sharing what I'd learned with other ranchers who were considering similar changes. "You're becoming quite the expert," Jason Rogers told me one afternoon when he stopped by to discuss some legal matters related to the organic certification. Lionel would be amazed to see what you've accomplished here. The comment made me think about how much I'd changed since that first phone call at the children's home. I'd gone from being a teenager with no family and no clear future to being a successful rancher with deep community connections and a growing reputation in sustainable agriculture. The transformation had been gradual enough that I hadn't always noticed it happening, but the contrast was striking when I looked back. That fall, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier. I applied to serve on the board of directors for the local Cattlemen's Association, putting myself forward as someone who could contribute to the leadership of the ranching community. The application required recommendations from other ranchers, financial statements demonstrating the success of my operation, and a statement of my goals and vision for the industry. The process of preparing the application made me reflect on how completely my life had changed. I was no longer someone asking for help and guidance. I was someone capable of providing leadership and expertise to others. The scared teenager who'd inherited a ranch he didn't understand had become a confident adult who could contribute meaningfully to his community. I was elected to the Cattlemen's Association Board in November, a recognition that felt like the final confirmation of my acceptance by the ranching community. The position came with responsibilities that extended beyond my own ranch, requiring me to think about industry-wide issues and advocate for policies that would benefit all ranchers in the region. My first board meeting coincided with discussions about proposed legislation that would affect grazing rights on public lands. The issues were complex, involving environmental concerns, economic impacts, and competing interests that required careful analysis and thoughtful compromise. I found myself drawing on everything I'd learned about both ranching and politics, contributing to discussions in ways that surprised even me. "You've got good instincts for this kind of work," said one of the veteran board members after my first meeting. "You understand both the practical and the policy sides of these issues." The board position also gave me opportunities to mentor younger ranchers who were just starting out, sharing the knowledge and experience I'd gained during my own learning process. It was satisfying to help others avoid mistakes I'd made and to contribute to the continuity of ranching traditions in our area. As winter approached, I found myself looking forward to the challenges ahead rather than dreading them. The seasonal rhythms of ranch life had become natural to me, and I had confidence in my ability to handle whatever difficulties arose. The work was still demanding, but it no longer felt overwhelming or uncertain. One evening in December, I was going through Lionel's papers again, looking for historical information to include in a presentation I was preparing about sustainable ranching practices. I found another letter I'd missed before, this one addressed not to me, but to whoever might eventually inherit the ranch. "To my successor," it began, "whether you are family or stranger, I hope you will understand that this ranch is more than property or business. It is a way of life, a connection to the land, and a responsibility to future generations. The cattle, the neighbors, the land itself, they all depend on the person who owns this place to make decisions with wisdom and care." The letter went on to describe Lionel's philosophy of ranching, his commitment to stewardship, and his hopes for the ranch's future. Reading his words, I realized that I'd internalized many of his values without consciously deciding to do so. The work itself had taught me what he'd wanted me to learn about responsibility, community, and the long-term perspective required for sustainable agriculture. "I hope," the letter concluded, "that whoever reads, this will find in this ranch not just a livelihood, but a home and a purpose. I hope you will love this land as I have loved it, and that you will pass that love on to the next generation." As I read those words, I understood that I'd fulfilled Lionel's hopes in ways that went beyond his expectations. I hadn't just learned to manage the ranch. I'd become part of the community and the landscape in ways that felt permanent and meaningful. The rootless teenager who'd inherited the property had found not just a home, but an identity and a purpose that would sustain me for the rest of my life. That night, I called Virginia Morris to give her my annual update on how things were going. She listened as I described the organic certification, the board position, and the various improvements I'd made to the ranch. "Jeffrey," she said when I finished, "do you remember what you were like when you left here 4 years ago? You were so uncertain about everything, so worried about your future." "I remember," I said. "I was terrified. And now listen to you. You're talking about board meetings and organic certification and mentoring other ranchers. You sound like someone who knows exactly who he is and what he's doing with his life. She was right. The transformation had been so gradual that I hadn't always noticed it happening, but the contrast was remarkable. I'd found not just a place to live, but a way of life that fit me perfectly. Now, 5 years after that first phone call changed everything. I'm sitting on the same porch where I first met Justin Baker, watching the sunrise over mountains that have become as familiar as old friends. The ranch has grown and prospered under my management. The organic program has exceeded all expectations, and I've built relationships in this community that will last a lifetime. The cattle in the pasture below are descendants of animals that Lionel raised, but they're also the result of breeding decisions that I've made and improvements I've implemented. The barn has been renovated and expanded, the fencing has been upgraded, and the house has been restored to a condition that would make Lionel proud. The ranch is both a continuation of his legacy and a reflection of my own vision for its future. Catherine Wright visits every summer now, and we've talked about the possibility of her moving to Montana permanently to help expand the organic program. Having family nearby would add another dimension to the life I've built here, connecting me even more deeply to the Kelly family history while creating new traditions for the future. The community that welcomed me cautiously 5 years ago now considers me one of their own. I serve on the school board as well as the Cattlemen's Association. I'm involved in the volunteer fire department, and I've helped organize the annual county fair for the past 3 years. These aren't just civic duties, they're expressions of my commitment to the place that has become home. Sometimes I think about the path my life might have taken if that phone call had never come, if Lionel had never found me, or if I decided to sell the ranch and take Justin Baker's money. I might have gone to college, might have found success in some urban career, might have built a different kind of life entirely. But I can't imagine being happier or more fulfilled than I am now. The work is still challenging, the weather's still unpredictable, and there are always problems to solve and improvements to make. But these challenges feel meaningful in ways that other work never could. I'm not just earning a living, I'm stewarding land that has been in my family for generations and will hopefully remain in the family for generations to come. The scared teenager who inherited a ranch he didn't understand has become a confident adult who can't imagine living anywhere else or doing anything else. I've found my place in the world, my purpose, and my people. The ranch that was supposed to be my inheritance became my salvation. And the grandfather I never met gave me not just property, but an identity and a future. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like you don't belong anywhere, like you don't have family or roots or a place to call home, I want you to know that sometimes those things find you in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes the life you're meant to live is nothing like the life you planned, and sometimes the family you need isn't the family you were born with. I'd love to hear your stories about unexpected gifts, found families, or times when your life took a completely different direction than you expected. Leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what unexpected turns your own life has taken. And if this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear that belonging and purpose can come from the most surprising places. The sun is fully up now, the cattle are moving toward their morning feeding area, and I can hear Michael's truck coming up the driveway for our daily planning session. It's going to be a good day on the ranch, just like yesterday was and just like tomorrow will be. I'm exactly where I belong, doing exactly what I'm meant to do, and I couldn't be more grateful for the grandfather I never met who somehow knew exactly what I needed.